Many parents are looking for discipline strategies to address their child's behavioral issues. And at the same time, more than half of children in the U.S. have been diagnosed with chronic health issues like asthma, allergies, chronic constipation, ADHD, autism, and more. Here's what you might not know. Our guest expert today says there's a link to nutrition, chronic illness, behavior, and mood.
Things like strep throat, ear infections, constipation, asthma, allergies, all of those things. And they kind of look at me like, wait a second, we were referred here to talk about our child's, mood issues or learning problems or behavior. Why are you asking about that? Because we sort of have been indoctrinated to think about those things as really separate issues. When we start to look at it as all these puzzle pieces that fit together and how one impacts the other, we start to say, wow, so doing things that reduce stress, giving kids coping strategies, focusing on, changing eating patterns, those kinds of things, they have a profound positive impact on all of these pieces. That's motivating. There's really good research evidence for the connections between nutrition, physical health, and mental health. And it opened up this entire new way of thinking about what is going on with kids who are having, emotional and behavioral and learning and developmental kinds of issues, and also opened up a realm then of treatment options and ways that we
And stay tuned till the end of the show where we'll show you how to make this super cute craft and fortune cookie recipe to give to your loved ones for Valentine's Day and Chinese New Year. And now for our Actions of Aloha segment. Our Actions of Aloha segment recognizes a group who have helped small local businesses during the pandemic. 3 organizations came together to create an online marketplace called Pop-Up Makiki. The Maui County Office of Economic Development, the Council for Native Hawaiian Advancement, and the City and County of Honolulu. Their online marketplace brought close to $2 million back into Hawaiian small businesses during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, many Native Hawaiian-owned businesses depended on craft fairs and farmers markets to sell their products. The virtual store is a hub for more than 360 Hawaiian small businesses who would have been cut off from customers if it weren't for this online hub. As a bonus result of bringing their products online is that people from all over the world can purchase products from the website, popupmakiki.com. And now for our main segment with Dr. Nicole Beurkens about child nutrition being linked to mood and behavior. Aloha, Dr. Nicole. Welcome to the CoronaMama Zoom room.
Thanks for having me. Great to be back.
Yes. So would you introduce yourself and tell us, the audience, if they didn't see your episode before, what you do?
I'm Dr. Nicole Beurkens. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So thus the sweater. I am, not in warm Hawaii, sadly. It is cold here. Professionally, I have a background in education, teaching, both special education and regular education. I also have a doctorate in clinical psychology, specializing in child and family psychology and issues. Also have a master's degree in nutrition and integrative health. And so I really merge all of those components of my background and my education into the work that I do with children, teens, young adults, and families around mental health, family health and wellness, neurodevelopmental issues, all of those things. On the personal side, I am a mom of 4. My kids are currently 14, 17, 19, and 21. So I've got older kids at home and navigating everything around the pandemic and kids sometimes being at school and sometimes at home and all of those pieces. So I am living that as a parent along with all of you and look forward to a great conversation today.
Me too. So, what's so perfect is that you can cover all those bases because we're going through this pandemic. There's emotional issues, which I know trigger body chemistry. And what we put into our body, and I know you can talk all about this, is the mood and behavior of children is in correlation with not only what's going on mentally, but physically and their nutrition. So I wanted to really focus on nutrition this time and how that merges, because we know our bodies, our minds, our spirits, everything is connected, but we need to have it broken down by someone who really knows. Is there a reason that you are so passionate about child nutrition? Because you were a psychologist
Mhm.
prior to getting into nutrition. So do you have a story behind that?
I do. Actually, it's sort of a merging of my personal and professional life. I was going along doing my clinical work as a psychologist, focusing in inpatient and outpatient medical settings with kids and in my private practice, and began to see these patterns emerging of kids who were coming in with similar kinds of physical types of issues, chronic infectious issues, history of lots of antibiotics, really picky eating, like all of these sort of themes that I started picking up. And then I started to notice that, more and more kids that I was seeing were on medication for, the mood or anxiety or behavioral kinds of issues that they were having. And yet they weren't really getting better. In fact, some of them were getting worse. And I started looking at all this and wondering, there's got to be some other piece out there that I'm missing or that's not being looked at for these kids. And that really got me delving into the research literature around the connection between food intake, nutrition in general, physical problems, and mental health problems. And on the professional side, I was like, wow, why aren't we being taught this in our mental health training? Unfortunately, there has long been this artificial distinction in the field of medicine between mental health and, physical health, like this idea that everything from the neck up, that's a mental health issue, go see a mental health person for that, and then everything else is physical. And of course, we inherently know that's ridiculous because the brain and the body are completely connected. And so everything about how we're functioning on a physical level impacts our mental function, impacts our mind, impacts our mood, impacts our behavior. So I began looking at all of that. And at the same time, on the personal side of things, two of my kids, one of my sons had had a longstanding history of eczema that wasn't really easily treated, and we were struggling with getting a handle on that. So I was starting to delve into what else outside, mainstream medicine might be helpful there. And that led me down a path of looking at the research on the nutritional components that play a role in that. And then my daughter started having some challenges with sleep, some behavior things, began to connect that to some allergy issues and some food sensitivity issues. So all of that on the personal and professional, ends of things sort of came together. And I started looking into, wow, there's really good research evidence for the connections between nutrition, physical health, and mental health. And it opened up this entire new way of thinking about what is going on with kids who are having, emotional and behavioral and learning and developmental kinds of issues. And also opened up a realm then of treatment options and ways that we can understand both what causes those types of things, or at least one of the components of that. And then also, new ways that we can treat it. So bringing in the nutrition piece was tremendously impactful, not only on the personal end for my own children and their issues, but also began using that in the clinic and really just saw such improvement then with kids as a result of bringing that in.
It seems like, and you can tell me if this is true, it seems like so many children are having issues behaviorally as well as nutritionally. There's
Yeah.
so many allergies, so there's so many intolerances to food. Is there a correlation between those two?
Mhm. Absolutely. And it's a great observation that you're making. And it's something I absolutely started seeing in practice, a little bit 20 years ago, but for sure 15 years ago, 10 years ago, it's like, what is up with all of these kids? It would be the rare day when a new patient would come in for an intake and they didn't have some history of environmental allergies, food allergies, asthma, those kinds of things. And you go, there's got to be something going on here. And in fact, what the research shows us now is there is this profound immune system connection that connects these kinds of things like, allergies and sensitivities and those types of things to mental health. And a lot of that has to do with the gut microbiome, and we can get into that a bit, but there absolutely are these connections. So it's funny because as a psychologist, parents will bring their kids in for an intake and I ask about, behavior and mood and those kinds of things. But then I quickly start to delve into things like, how many bowel movements does your child have every day or every week? You know, what are their eating habits like? How are they sleeping? What kind of medical history do they have? History of things like strep throat, ear infections, constipation, asthma, allergies, all of those things. And they kind of look at me like, wait a second, we were referred here to talk about our child's, you know, mood issues or learning problems or behavior. Why are you asking about that? Because we sort of have been indoctrinated to think about those things as really separate issues. And yet when I start to explain the connections of those to parents, it makes so much sense. And they go, you know, I've always kind of wondered about that. Or, and so it is this fascinating, you know, world that it opens up to really look at this. And parents inherently feel like, oh, that makes so much more sense to look at my child as this complete being. Many times they make connections for themselves too. Like moms will say, you know, I've always wondered, you know, about the connection between my anxiety and the development of this autoimmune condition that I had, or, you know, things like that. And so it helps parents make sense a lot of times of the connection with their own issues as well. But we are absolutely seeing an increase in both these physiological types of issues in kids, allergies, sensitivities, asthma, diabetes, blood sugar dysregulation, all of those things, at the same time as we're seeing a significant increase in kids having developmental and mental health kinds of issues. And those two paths are very, very connected for sure.
It seems like a chicken and the egg thing. If one thing's imbalanced, then it kind of will trigger the other.
Yeah, typically, I think, especially in children, it starts with some physiological imbalances, some, you know, things going on in the body that then start them on this different trajectory or path as far as their development, as far as their brain function. But then it all becomes this, as you said, chicken and egg, like which came first, this cycle, right? Because as things start to become problematic on a physical level, you know, whether that's issues with digestion or detoxification, it's issues with blood sugar regulation, it's issues with chronic infections, that then impacts brain development and brain function. And then the increased stress, anxiety, mood, behavior issues that result then circle back and have a negative impact on, you know, the physical problems. So it does really become this cycle. And the key is understanding that all of that's connected. So often we think, well, we have to, you know, this is completely separate from that and that. And when we start to look at it as all these puzzle pieces that fit together and how one impacts the other, you know, we start to say, wow, so doing things that reduce stress, giving kids coping strategies, focusing on, you know, changing eating patterns, those kinds of things, they have a profound positive impact on all of these pieces. That's motivating then, right? To think, wow, I can shift a bit about what I'm doing in terms of feeding my child, or what we're doing in terms of routines at home, or getting physical movement or mindfulness strategies, and that impacts all of the pieces of this. That's empowering, and I think that is encouraging to parents too, to feel like, wow, I can do these things and it impacts all of these areas in really positive ways.
So it sounds like being curious about what could it be and laying out a lot of different scenarios instead of just automatically. I think we're a society that just goes to the expert. I'm not saying experts are not going to help us, but
Right.
there's an assumption. If they go to a psychotherapist and it's a nutritional issue and they don't go to you because most psychologists don't have that background,
Right.
they will never know.
Right.
So for moms, there's a lot of taking the time. And I know that's a lot to ask of moms, but at the same time, if we don't, there's a lot on the back end that we have to pick up the pieces,
Right.
and it takes longer. So just taking that time to do that. I really wanted to get into the microbiome because I know that's an expertise of yours. And I started taking the microbiome labs supplements because I just know the quality of those. But I kind of wondered, for a child, how do we deal with a child's microbiome?
You know, whether it's a child that I'm seeing in my practice because they have, you know, a mental health kind of challenge, or they have chronic infections or, whatever it may be, supporting microbiome health is really beneficial for all of us. In my family, we all take measures both through the way that we eat, as well as some of the supplements that we take and just our lifestyle to support gut microbiome, because it really is at the heart of what it means to be healthy. It's at the heart of being able to have a well-functioning immune system. The majority of our immune system is in our gut, and our microbiome balance has everything to do with that. So especially during a pandemic, one of the best things that we can be doing, taking enough vitamin D, getting enough sleep, managing our stress, but also making sure that we're supporting a healthy microbiome, because that's really what gives us robust immune function. I am a fan of the Microbiome Labs products. I use them often with kids. There's kind of two different approaches supplementation wise as far as supporting the microbiome. Just for those of you listening who maybe aren't as familiar, some of the ways that we can support a healthy gut microbiome through food are things like reducing the sugar, making sure that we're eating a good blend of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, healthy fats. Those are all things that are important. Also something called fermented foods, whether that is kimchi or sauerkraut, or even things like, pickled vegetables, all of those things that a lot of times kids will go, oh, what is that? Those kind of fermented foods, yogurt's a great example of a fermented food that lots of kids do eat, as long as it doesn't have too much sugar in it. Mm-hmm. Fermented foods have all those really good bacteria in them and microorganisms that then help to diversify our gut microbiome and keep it healthy. But supplements are a way to do that. And they're sort of traditional probiotics, which the idea behind that is putting these things called like lactobacilli strains of bacteria, bifido strains, these good health promoting strains of bacteria, putting them in a capsule, and you sort of take those every day to help put that good bacteria in there. That's one way of addressing that, and that can be helpful. Another way is through using what we call spore biotics. So these spore-based probiotics, spores are a specific type of bacteria that form what's called a spore around them, this kind of spore casing, and you can take those in a supplement form. And what those do, it's not like just putting these microorganisms in there. Those get into the gut and actually help create an environment where the good guys in our gut can actually thrive. So the spores help to create more of this sort of fertile garden where all of the good things in our gut can grow. So it's a bit of a different approach. I use both in my practice, but I really do tend to use more of the spores, because over time then, you just get this better functioning microbiome, and you don't have to keep taking the probiotic capsules every day to put those strains in you. So there's lots of good research behind spore biotics. Megaspore Biotic is the Microbiome Labs sort of cornerstone spore biotic product. I do use that with children. It is absolutely fine to use even with babies. It is fine for pregnant women to use all the way through the lifespan. So a spore biotic formula is great for the whole family. And then also sometimes we'll look at using things like a prebiotic formula, which can be thought of as the good foods that the good bacteria like to eat, certain kinds of fibers and things. Those come in supplement forms. They come in powder forms. I like the one from Microbiome Labs called Mega Pre, because it tastes kind of like a raspberry lemonade. You can just mix it into your water or, a beverage. It's easy for kids to take. So some of those kinds of things are helpful. They just kind of amp up the good things that we might be doing through our diet and lifestyle. And definitely if a child or a parent is having, a clinical problem, whether it is something like autism or ADHD or anxiety or, a physical health issue, certainly the supplementing and using those as a component of treatment can be very, very important.
I'm wondering, once our microbiome gets regulated or is healthy, do the taste buds of children change? Are they going to crave less sugar and have more of a taste for vegetables?
Absolutely. That happens in a couple ways. One of the ways is by regulating that microbiome, getting a better balance there. But another way is just by exposure. So no child who hasn't been exposed to like greens or, vegetables is going to pick that up and go, oh, this is delicious. It's like, ice cream versus spinach, like no brainer there, right? But we can start to shift kids' palates. And if you think about that, even as an adult, if any of you have, tried to reduce your sugar intake, you know that the first few days are really hard, right? It's like you just crave it, you want it. It's that addictive mechanism in the brain. And that's a whole nother conversation, but it is actually addictive to our brain. So you really want it. We get headachy, we get irritable as we're kind of coming off of it. But then as you get into a week out from eliminating or reducing sugar, and then 2 weeks out, you realize that you're not craving it anymore, and that you are, fine with eating other things. You're not constantly wanting the sugar. Well, guess what? The same thing happens for kids. So as we start to expose them, and that exposure might start with just having them help cook in the kitchen as you're making a salad, as you're making, a dish for dinner that has vegetables in it. It might mean putting it on their plate. Okay, you don't have to eat it, but you're going to have the Brussels sprouts or the broccoli or the lettuce or whatever it is there. That's right. It's how you start exposing them to the sights, the sounds, the smells, the textures. It's how you acclimate them. And as you start to pull back on a lot of the sugary processed stuff, they begin to have a palate that expands then for other kinds of things. But you do have to, if you provide a steady stream of those sort of simple carb, sugar heavy, processed, really, sweet or processed fatty foods, it's really hard to change their palate because that is an addictive process. So you have to sort of pull back on that while at the same time exposing them to other things. And it is absolutely possible. I have families at the clinic who parents told me at the beginning, like they would never imagine that their kid would, eat a vegetable or, eat maybe like a whole grain bread as opposed to like the Wonder White bread, or would give up their cheese because that's another super addictive substance. But over time and with strategies, they absolutely do. And we end up with lots of kids at the clinic who are robust, fruit and vegetable eaters who have really shifted their diet, some of them because quite frankly, they absolutely had to with how severe their symptoms were. And some of them because parents just were like, we need to make some changes here. Like this isn't working. So it absolutely is possible to do that. And it's important because kids who grow up seeing parents eating diverse, healthy diets, and who have exposure to that, the research is clear. Those kids grow up to be adults who have more diverse, nutrient-dense, healthy eating patterns. So it's really something that it's a privilege to instill in our kids, but it does need to start with us. We can't tell our kids, eat the carrot when we're having the Twinkie, it has to start with us. And so if you're listening to this and you're feeling overwhelmed, you're like, I know that I need to change my kid's diet. Like I know this isn't good, but I don't know where to start. Start with yourself. Start with your modeling. Start with observing and noticing how you're eating, what your kids are seeing you eating, what you're doing for your own brain and body and health, and start there. And that's the beginning point. And then you start setting that example. You start having more things in the house and it grows from there. And the great thing about that is we have total control over ourselves. We don't have control over what our kids do, but we can control ourselves and our behavior and the model that we're setting. And so that's a really lovely and impactful starting point.
I love that. I was just thinking how when my kids were really little, I think being playful with it is really a cool thing. So I would say, I'm going to take a little mouse bite. Do you want to take a mouse bite or do you want to take a tiger bite? And then they would get into it just because they imagine that animal doing that thing without thinking about the vegetable.
That's right. But snacks are another great place to do that. Snacks are not required for kids, as kids do need to have consistent meals for their growth. Like there's sort of this trend towards fasting and all of that right now. That is not for kids. Kids need to have consistent calorie intake throughout the day. But snacks are a great place to expose them to some different things, because it's okay for a kid not to have a snack. So you could say, you know, here's a few of your crackers and here's some blueberries. I don't want the blueberries. You say, well, that's okay. That's what's for snack today. You can eat it or not eat it. And that's a great way to expose them without worrying like, oh my gosh, what if they don't eat it? They're not going to grow. Like, you know, it's not going to be good for them. So you can do some exposure through some of those extra snacks, and then, you know, take it or leave it. If they leave it, that's fine. They were exposed to it. But that's a good way of just sort of inching into that, right? It's like, here's a few of the things you're used to, then here's some new. You don't have to eat it, but this is what's for snack. And you just can leave it on the counter or, you know, whatever, and kind of just let them explore that. And there's so many strategies and techniques that are great for working on shifting kids' eating patterns and dealing with picky eaters and all of that. But just for parents to know that it's absolutely possible.
If someone were to say, have a completely blank slate of an empty cupboard, and you were to say the things that we should put in our cupboard, say we just start from zero, and what are the things that you would say they should really have to have a healthy family?
Most of what you want to focus on is what's in your fridge and on your counter, actually.
Okay.
One of the best ways to think about it is when you go in the grocery store, you want to shop the perimeter of the grocery store, which tends to be your produce department, your meat department, those kinds of things. What's all on the interior aisles of the store are all of your processed, you know, not so great foods. So that's a good way to think about it, that really we want to fill our homes with fruits and vegetables, with things like nuts, with whole grains, you know, things like, and I'm not a big proponent of wheat products and gluten in general, but, you know, whole wheat as opposed to, you know, things made with white flours and those kinds of things. We want to look at healthy fats. We want to have things like avocado and nut butters and, you know, even sweeteners like honey and those kinds of things, or you know, maple syrup instead of the big bag of white sugar. So those are some things to keep in mind. Really, a lot of that is what we have in the fridge, right? I mean, one of the ways to think about it is if most of what we're eating is coming out of the pantry or the cupboard in the form of cans and boxes, that's not going to be as nutrient, which is not to say that those aren't appropriate. Because let me tell you, I'm a mom of four. Like, we eat our share of packaged things. Totally. That's like reasonable, right? Especially when it comes to snacks and things that the kids take to school. But we are intentional about looking at the ingredients on that. So there's a difference between, let's say, well, what's something we had yesterday, like a can of soup, where you look at the ingredients and it's this long and there's a bunch of things you can't pronounce and it's got added sugar and chemicals, versus a can of soup that has, you know, chicken, carrots, celery, salt, oregano. You're like, oh, those are things that I know what those are. I would cook with those things. That's how you want to look at it. Even things like fruit snacks, right? There's fruit snacks that you can buy that have an ingredient list this long with artificial colors, flavors, 18 grams of added sugar, versus there are fruit snacks that you can buy that are organic and non-GMO, that have natural colors, that just use the fruit flavors, that maybe have 6 grams of added sugar. So it's really about making better choices is how I look at it. It's not like this is good and this is bad, or, you know, we're aiming for perfect versus imperfect. It's like just looking at up-leveling, like making a better choice. Okay, so if your kids are really into granola bars, you say, okay, where are we at with that now? Is there a swap that we can make so that we can still have granola bars, but it's better? It's maybe made with whole grains instead of refined. It doesn't have sugar as the first ingredient. It doesn't have high fructose corn syrup. There's no artificial dyes and chemicals. Okay, this granola bar has, you know, 5 grams of added sugar. The one that we were eating had 12 grams of added sugar. So you just start to look at those and you say, oh, and you can feel good about making that choice then, right? It's not about, oh my gosh, we have to get up at 3 a.m. to prepare all of our food from scratch using things grown in our own garden. Like, God bless the people who do that. Like, that's awesome. If people are living a life where they can do that, that's not the reality of my life and most of our lives. So it's not about, oh my gosh, I either have to do all of that or, you know, oh, we just can't do this at all. There's a great middle ground. to be found in just making better, more informed choices.
Join us next week for part 2 with Dr. Nicole Beurkens on child anxiety, depression, and stress during the pandemic and beyond. And until then, here's how you can find and connect with Dr. Nicole. And don't forget to stay for the Valentine's Day Chinese New Year's craft and recipe at the end of the show. Okay, well, that is our show for this week. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you back here next week. For now, take care, stay safe, and be well. Aloha.